The invisible, I'm using this because the only way I can be assured of speaking to time is to read, so my apologies. The invisible radio sky displays an indirect visibility, seen in radio astronomy's towering or spreading collectors, its adept practitioners, you, and its memorable visualizations. One need hardly be a boffin to discern the variability of that visibility between different cultures. If no radio astronomer has yet achieved pop status, several monumental telescopes have made the transition from antenna to icon, and their radio quiet sites have become household words. It works. Oh. In England, the antenna, which was to become Mark I at Jodrell Bank, achieved iconic status as a post-war big science proof of technical, industrial, and scientific prowess, abetted by the well-publicized politicization of the discomforts of its financing and the popular perception of the telescope's role in tracking Sputnik 1. In radio and cinematic documentaries of the time, the telescope shared star billing with its scientific progenitor, Bernard Lovell, OBE. It wasn't lighted then. And it subsequently featured in at least 7 episodes of the inexplicably popular Doctor Who. Visible from the Pennines on a clear day, the Great Dish's physicality dominates its immediate landscape, more than Stonehenge does its. In fact, a recent paper in the journal Antiquity attempts to treat the Lovell telescope as a monument in its landscape. The way one would intellectually situate Newgrange in the Boyne Valley, or Fraunhofer's Optical Institute at Benedict Boyron. Think of Antiquity as monthly notices mixed with Observatory, but for archaeologists. As the Lovell telescope is an icon in the UK, so the Parkes radio telescope is iconic in Australia. A recent paper on its planning and construction is labeled an Australian icon. The Parkes antenna now enjoys a familiar lexical identity simply as the dish. And, like its British symbolic equivalent, it too has made it to the big screen in a film from 2000 called The Dish, which certainly served to amplify its popular reputation by stimulated exposure. I don't know who writes this stuff. In the realm of the popular imagination of our neighbors to the south, no single dish or array seems to clearly command the representative status of the Lovell or Parkes telescopes within their respective national cultures. You'll probably disagree with me, which is fine. Perhaps the 305-meter Arecibo dish or the Karl Jansky Very Large Array just might qualify. They both feature in the 1997 film of Sagan's Contact, as well as in the earlier novel from 1985. And Arecibo is in the setting of the climactic action of GoldenEye, a film not about astronomers. The 91.44-meter telescope, formerly at Green Bank, or its replacement, the Robert C. Byrd Green Bank telescope, are imposing. They're big. But what is their visual name recognition in popular culture? The difference in popular status between Britain's Lovell and Australia's Parkes telescopes on the one hand, and that of their American counterparts on the other, may be due to factors such as longevity, scientific longevity, the timing and nature of their early public exposure, and their historic relative economic weight within the portfolio of each country's big science projects. What then of Canada? A World's Fair is usually a signal occasion, all the more so when it coincides with a milestone in the host country's narrative, such as a centenary. Most nations make the most of such occasions to draw attention to the recent scientific triumphs, current and projected technical capacities, and cultural aspirations. If all goes well, the host country can expect large national and international audiences for their spectacle of progress, whatever that is. Canada's turn came when Montreal was the locus for the International and Universal Exposition of 1967, more commonly known as Expo 67. And radio astronomy was indeed on show. In the British Pavilion was on display Stanley Hayes' interferometer at the Royal Radar Establishment. In the French Pavilion, one could discover an exhibit on the Krauss-type Great Radio Telescope at Nancy, and, most memorably photogenic in the Australian pavilion was a scale model of the Parkes telescope. That. What then of Canada? Katamavik, the main Canadian pavilion, featured on its inverted pyramidal roof models of antique astronomical instruments pretentiously arrayed. You could find an astrolabe, sunglasses, Galileo's pendulum for some reason, and William Lassell's 1.2 meter reflector, all accepting the reflector at megafaunal sizes. What message is conveyed, or was conveyed, about the state of Canadian science when the most recent astronomical instrument displayed there is a British speculum metal mirror reflector from 1850? What does it say, you know? Prominently absent was any representation of the two largest Canadian single-dish radio telescopes, the one outside here, and the Algonquin 46-meter dish completed the year before Expo, nor was there any reference to any of the programs that had been started for the last 20 years in Canadian radio astronomy, some of which were still ongoing, like the Solar Survey, the Continuum Survey. The Canadian display certainly displayed a visual contrast with the vision of modern British, French, and Australian science, and not in a good way. So much for the roof of lost opportunity. The Algonquin 46-meter telescope did make a 2-second cameo appearance in the tourism movie screened in the Ontario Pavilion. One wonders what proportion of the general public would have known that they'd caught a fleeting daytime glimpse of Canada's latest and largest single-dish radio telescope if they'd not first been to the Australian Pavilion to see Parkes and its explanatory panels. From the beginning of radio astronomy in Canada to the dawn of widespread internet use, newsprint was one of the principal mediums for informing and forming public opinion. What is the image of radio astronomy conveyed by the Canadian press? To determine this is more difficult than it sounds, due to what one recent commentator has called, quote, the sorry state of Canada's digital newspaper archive, an archive which is very limited, fragmented, and difficult to access, whose searchability is impaired by the poor OCR software which has been employed. Terrific. My remarks are based on an examination of a single newspaper. That's never a good historical route, as Woody would tell you. The Toronto Star, from its first mention of radio astronomy in 1951 to the beginning of 2000. During this period, the Star enjoyed the largest daily circulation of any Canadian newspaper. It also had a long-standing commitment to covering science, in particular astronomy. It had a regular astronomy columnist, first Frank Hogg, then Helen Hogg, then Terry Dickinson. Helen had the longest run, and as you all know, she's Dave Hogg's two parents were the columnists in succession. The Star can be considered as broadly pro-science in the period, with a desire to appear informed, like me. The data and interpretation presented here have the greatest applicability to the Toronto area, but they are hardly complete for that locale, and they may be relevant to other areas, but don't take my word for it, it should be checked first. There are numerous ways coverage can be assessed. One is through the treatment of scientific discoveries. Oops, there we go. Between 1947 and 1968, D.W.R. McKinley, Bruce McIntosh, in cooperation with Peter Millman, amassed an impressive database of millions of photographs of meteor radar echoes. I mean, millions of these things. It's unbelievable. This was in the context of vigorous international efforts to settle the question of the velocity and therefore the character of meteor orbits, whether solar system or interstellar phenomena. McKinley's published analysis of 1951 agreed with the Jodrell Bank work in favor of a solar system origin. This was a significant finding of a well-funded and productive NRC project, which ought to have interested the scientific literate laity, yet nothing appeared in the Star at the time. It was noted a full decade later in a single line, and there it is. Delay also characterizes the reportage of the successful VLBI experiment of 1967. It appeared in the Star half a year after the papers in Science and Nature, marooned on page 70 between Ann Landers and a bridge quiz. Better than not being mentioned at all, I suppose. Is that the first one? No, can I go up? Yeah, that's right, okay. Numbers are always interesting. Jodrell Bank is mentioned nearly twice as often as the next most frequently cited observatory, the ARO. And Algonquin only gets in there because in the 1980s, press is interested in all the problems of what Mulrooney is going to do. Is it going to close? Is it not going to close? The radio astronomer the star cites most often is Sir Bernard Lovell by a factor of 5. See him up there. Very impressive. Next is Tony Hewish. We finally reach a Canadian astronomer with, in third place, Phil's smiling. It's him. He gets the prize. Phil was a good interview, actually. It's obvious. And he was available in Toronto. So, next. As for discoveries and programs, satellite tracking beats out SETI by a factor of 1.5, and SETI beats out everything else by at least a factor of 5. A reader of Canada's largest circulation daily, who followed radio astronomy for half a century, would think that Bernard Lovell was the most important radio astronomer in the world, Jodrell Bank was the only significant installation, and that radio astronomers spent most of the time tracking space probes with a bit of SETI on the side. Does any of this matter? Was this an adequate representation of your field at the time? Is the reportage any better now? What should be the nature of the public understanding of science? Does radio astronomy require a place in the public discourse? And what would effective citizen involvement look like? What benefit would accrue to your work if it were better represented in the public sphere? And finally, how on earth can improvement in these things be meaningfully engineered? Thanks.
Thank you. Well, Helen Hogg told us once that she used to write a regular column in one Canadian newspaper. And somehow she was able to obtain from the editorial office of what column would be eliminated in a day's newspaper in case of breaking news. At the top of the list, her column would be eliminated.
It's good to know this. Thank you. That might explain a lot. Oh, it's a big, it's a big scientific discovery. Oh, well, I can, into the waste bin. Yeah, I think decades ago, the responsibility of an astronomer, particularly one employed by the state, was to do good science, and that's still the case. I don't think there was such an emphasis on education and public outreach, though I would have to temper that with saying that within the first 5 years of the opening of this, a visitor's guide was produced. I don't know if you've seen it. It has a blue cover. It's about half the size of this. Yep. It's unsigned. Do you know who wrote it?
I don't, but we have some upstairs.
I'd be interested to know who wrote that. There was also one for the DAO, and there are provisions at the DAO. They lost a considerable amount of observing time. This is very early. Considerable amount of observing time by showing the public around. And it's interesting that going back to the beginning of the 20th century, you can find that. It's now become, there seems to be a realization that there should be more effort spent on education and public outreach. Meanwhile, they're cutting you're getting less money for staff, and people are expecting you to be more productive all the time. So how the hell are you going to make room for this? I don't know. Woody?
Peter Millman obviously really had good connections with amateurs, as you pointed out, and so forth. But apparently he wasn't the kind that liked to talk to reporters. I mean, it would seem like he'd be the natural person to...
I have a story about that. That's partly a fault of my data. I'll get to that in a minute. Millman was actually the first, I should have mentioned him, he was the first writer for the Stars column, but he only did it for a year or two. Then he signed up for war service. This is in the Second World War. When he came back, the position had already been filled, was already filled by the Hogs. So he signed up with the rival newspaper, the Telegram. And I want to look at his his papers, because I would expect at the very least that he reported what his colleagues were doing with the meteor radar.
Okay.
I would think. So I should check that.
Any further questions? Yes, why not?
Hi, Randall, I'm the tour guide here at the Observatory, and I've been doing tours for 13 years, and I have to make a comment about this here. Absolutely spot on when it comes to what the public want to know more about, and SETI or aliens is probably the number one thing people ask me about. And then the second thing is the space programs, the space probes, things like that. Other than that, they don't mention it, and pretty much anything else is not even mentioned. And I've noticed over the past 13 years, more and more questions are geared to things like aliens, and less and less.
It's
on the
gotten
science.
worse.
It's getting worse.
Yeah.
And so, anyways, I just wanted to bring that up to let you know that
That's interesting to know.
yeah. You're spot on with your
It's disturbing.
article,
Yeah, I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry to hear that.
Yeah, and people are convinced that aliens exist. I mean, it's like, it's not even a question.
Of course they exist.
It's
They
not-
populated the last conservative government. That's the only explanation I can think of.
And Wendell, I don't know if you noticed in Joseph's talk, beside the front sign up there in the 60s also had weekend tours, so exactly your point. A lot of effort was still going to educating the public even back then here at the area.
And of course, you guys were prevented from doing that for about a decade recently. And, well, yeah. You get, well, this may be naive. I still believe that you want democracy to work. You want an educated electorate, an electorate who can think for themselves, makes it harder for them to be taken in. And one way is to make them scientific, literate in science. And I just don't, it's not so much facts, but the process, how scientists do their work. To critically look at things and processes, that's what you want. And you think anyone would want to do that with whatever the hell they did. And so anything you can do to further that is a very, very good thing. How one does that effectively, I mean, I think interferometry, both in its history and in its modern, I mean, the things we heard today, and its the most recent application. I mean, anything you've talked about today is fascinating, but how to convey that to the public in a way that's exciting. I think people are disposed to be fair. People are favorably disposed towards astronomy. Part of that is because of what you're dealing with. Also, the image thing, and that might create some problems for radio astronomy. Though, as Woody points out very early on, it became a visual. The visual mode of conveying the information was seen as very important. But and you also deal with cataclysmic events. And I know small children like that, basically things blowing up, or great energy and power being involved. So, of course, you wanted to be able to do that without prostituting the science. It's not easy, as you would know.
Well,
Do you get astrologers? Oh God.
all right, let's thank.
Oh.
Thanks, Randall. Okay, so that brings everything to an
Before
end.
Tim says anything more, tremendous thanks.